Matthew.
Okay, so what you just heard from Steve are ways to protect the mind at the national level. I'm not only going to talk about protecting the mind at the national level, also the international level, namely by UN recognised human right to freedom of mind. I'll start off with a brief overview of freedom of mind in history, then the pre-existing legal basis for freedom of mind, and then the justification, why we need freedom of mind. So freedom of mind, depending on how you search it, it has an earliest time as the end of the 1500s. It appears the most interesting appearance is in the play by Comus, where a sorcerer kidnaps a noblewoman and tries to seduce her with the charms of body and pleasure. She resists his attempts and she exerts her freedom of mind. And the message given by this is that no matter what you do, you will never have my freedom of mind. You can take away my body, you will never get my soul. However, there were also references in the literature to protecting freedom of mind. Why do we protect something that's already innate to human nature? Is this contradictory? Freedom of mind appears in texts about the American Revolution, and also in anti-colonial and anti-segregationist writings, the idea that mental slavery, you can take away that the real obstacle to human freedom is not in the physical constraints, it is in the mind. Malcolm X, for example, talks about the house Negro, the black slave who loved his master with all his heart and soul. Go on. There, Joyce Carey ties freedom of mind to liberty for the first time in writing. The French La Liberté d'Esprit enters into the literature slightly later, but not that much. And Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, he writes, Je ne connais qu'une liberté, c'est la liberté d'esprit. It's also associated with Paul Valéry, another French writer. Freedom of mind appears in Buddhist writings, and it's understood as a sort of freedom of mind from the unwanted or uncontrolled forces or processes in sort of inner peace, creativity, imagination. Freedom of mind is also associated with cognitive liberty theorists, and cognitive liberty theorists argue for the freedom of mind, understood as the right to control your own consciousness, be it through mind-altering drugs or neuroenhancements, DBS, for example. Freedom of mind in the context of mental health. And then this is how I came across it, freedom of mind as in response to the problem of authoritarian cults. Okay, so the first call for freedom of mind that I found was in 1848. We plead for a universal and most determined recognition of the freedom of mind. Then later, over a century later, was a call for mental privacy, an international right to mental privacy, to protect dissidents and patients from involuntary incarceration, chemical-based surgery, particularly in the Soviet Union, but also in the United States. Then you heard from Alan Shefflin before. He made a call in 1982. Stronger and more explicit protection for the mind must be written into international human rights documents. The task will not be an easy one. International consensus will have to be obtained on such issues as what constitutes freedom of mind. This is a formidable undertaking, and yet the world cannot afford to be in a defensive position. Moving forward a decade, in 1990, an EU committee investigating the problem of cults called for any type of treaty to prevent acts which jeopardize human freedom. Again, the cognitive liberty theorists have made various calls: a human right to mental self-determination, cognitive liberty. More recently, some of them have moved to an all-encompassing protection, the freedom of the mind. And then in 2020, we have the first declaration of freedom of mind. Just in way of some background, the World Mental Health Coalition produced this following the second impeachment and amidst the silencing of mental health professionals who had a duty to warn. So this is the first, as I mentioned, it's the first document, and finally we have a blueprint, something which you can use to take for any future submission to the United Nations. So there is something called rights inflation, that we could create a human right for almost every single social practice. So some people have introduced quality control for rights. human right must reflect a fundamentally important social value, be consistent but not merely repetitive of existing human rights, achieve a very high degree of international consensus, sufficiently precise, respond to a serious threat, and impose burdens that are justifiable and no larger than necessary. I believe that the human right to freedom of mind meets all these criteria. Its existing basis is in the international human rights architecture, intrinsic freedom. All humans are born free. No one should be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery should be prohibited in all their forms. One, personality rights, the right to be a person who has integrity, inviolability of one's person. Privacy rights, freedom of thought, belief, conscience. Now, there are three things contained within these rights. No one should be coerced into holding a right. People should have the freedom to seek and impart information and ideas. And that children should have access to information from a diversity and variety of sources. The right to mental health, which is explicitly catered for in the international human rights treaties. Moreover, that no one should be subjected to any mental suffering or any medical or scientific experimentation. So there is a foundational hierarchy to human rights with prerequisite rights of existing rights. Freedom of mind is the prerequisite for the other rights. What use is freedom of thought if you do not have freedom of mind? What use is freedom of speech if you do not have freedom of thought? Now, human rights are both positive and negative. They're negative in the sense they protect them against violation against oneself, but they're positive in the sense that they give you entitlement to a service, freedom from misinformation, propaganda, freedom to think, lead, individuality. Now, I mentioned cognitive liberty theorists before. They're arguing for freedom of mind in a very different way to the Declaration. The Declaration speaks of freedom of mind through a sense of education. Cognitive liberty theorists are arguing for expanding the mind through neuroenhancements. So any future development of freedom of mind will have to either expand to include cognitive liberty theorists and this expansive use of the mind, or be limited. Okay, so human rights are reflected in three ways in international law. Treaties, covenants, and conventions, which are negotiated between states. These have full legal force. Customary law, which is the notion that law develops from consistent practice by states. Even if there is no pre-existing law, consistent practice of states over time will contribute to human rights law. And lastly, declarations, which are submitted to the United Nations General Assembly and which by nature are declaratory, but which do not have legal force in of themselves. We call them hard law and soft law. Okay, so in terms of a brief history, we began with the Declaration in 1948, declaratory, no legal force. This was then followed by two covenants a few decades later. What does this mean for the freedom of mind? Will a declaration suffice? Or an international covenant suffice with full legal force? There's a question whether the freedom of mind will require the development of pre-existing rights or the addition of new mind-specific rights. It's unclear whether the pre-existing human rights will cater and will deliver enough protection for the mind today and in the future. And the answer to that question will tell us whether a declaration or a covenant, a treaty, will suffice to protect the mind. Any future declaration will have to be translated into the 5 official languages of the UN. This is from the working groups of the UDHL. So this is the linguistical nightmare that's going to face any future coalition. Every single word and phrase will have to be translated into 5 different languages. And this also presents an opportunity for opponents of freedom of mind to push back and to try and water down the right and reduce its strength. So, how do we get from here to here? Freedom of mind as a human right is a fundamentally political undertaking. It's not simply legal. And what I want to pursue, what I want to identify as a pathway from freedom into the human rights architecture, and I'm hoping to pursue this at a doctoral level. Human rights are more than law. They're more than law. They exist in society as well as law. So there's a risk in only focusing on legal aspects. Individuals need to know what a right constitutes if they are to make a claim for that right. So, when you search freedom of mind in Wikipedia, this is what you get. Stephen Hassan, individualism and free will. Even the sub-rights don't have any pages, except with the exception of cognitive liberty. So I'm hoping to start building on the Wikipedia pages just to create a more popular understanding of the freedom of mind. Okay, now, why we need it. There are different ways we understand which someone's freedom of mind can be taken away. The dissociative precut self, introjection. These are more in these are in the instances of cults. Also doubling. This is how the Nazi doctors would maintain a self while they carried out their experimentation in prisoners, and would continue a normal life outside of the concentration camps. And then in a more general way, you have the false self, with the real self hiding behind it. Okay. Go. Steve, how am I doing for time?
You need to go because we have one more.
Right.
You need to leave a little time for questions.
So there's Plato's allegory of the cave, that men were trapped inside the cave, and all they saw was the shadows on the wall. The shadows were more real than reality. And when one man was free from his cage, he came back to free the others, and they reacted violently and rejected his attempts to impart knowledge upon them. So I call this rational ignorance, when the cost of knowledge exceeds the benefits of that knowledge. No one wants to be lied to, and no one wants to admit they've been lied to. So some people speak of the freedom of the cage. I find this quite oxymoronic. I prefer the security of the cage, but absolutely there is a security. I mean, I've lived in authoritarian and totalitarian societies, and some people really don't want freedom. You know, they don't want information. They don't want to act on their own. You know, it's not something that comes naturally, and I don't think it's the natural human condition until recently. So is there more access denied or access not wanted? So what does this mean? Does the fact that some people are unwilling or unable to exercise freedom of mind eliminate the need for it? Not one bit. This is based on a profound misunderstanding of how human rights work. You don't need to justify why you need a right. You don't need to say, I have freedom of speech because I have something to say. Okay. Now, I also work as a teacher, and over half my class are from Hong Kong, and over 100,000 Hong Kongers have recently left the country. And when you ask them why, they will say consistently, we did it for our children. We did it for our children. As changes are made to the curriculum in Hong Kong, as critical thinking is taken out, replaced with patriotic education, they're leaving. They're saying they're saying this is not what we want for our children. Same thing is happening in Turkey. Science is being removed from the curriculum and being replaced with religion. The assault on the infant's mind is as much religious as it is political. So this is the 21st century assault on the infant's mind. This is the 21st century refugee exodus. And they're demanding our protection. They need our protection. But they need to understand what is happening to them. And they need to understand the right to freedom of mind so that they can more effectively make a claim for it. Is this going to work? No? Okay. The director of Terminator 2 Judgment Day, James Cameron, recently made a public intervention. And he said this: if Skynet wanted to take over and wipe us out, it would actually look a lot like what's going on now. It would be much cheaper and easier just to turn our minds against ourselves. Lastly, on human rights. Do not underestimate the challenge facing the human rights system this century. Human rights have piggybacked and freeloaded on Western power, and as Western power fades, it may well take the human rights system with it. So, what if only fighting for its survival, human rights went on the offensive. And what better way to go on the offensive than with the right to freedom of mind? And I'll finish with this quote from Snowden. It's this clash between the authoritarian and the liberal democratic that I believe to be the major ideological conflict of my time. How best to win this conflict than with freedom of mind as a human right?
Wow. High five.
Woo!
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Ashok Man from US. In terms of undue influence, it has been there for a long time. For example, isn't it true the Catholic Church, for example, got very rich because the last rites were always given by the priest, and then they
You don't
didn't
have
have
to
anything to
convince me.
write. So what happens is the priest would come and say, "We donated such and such things to that church."
I actually, I'm going to interrupt you just for a purpose of time. I wrote a blog with a former Catholic priest about the schism in the Catholic Church with those people who love Jesus and believe that Jesus' words when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world," and what's called dominionism or Christian nationalism, which is a big component of the cult of Trump. And that's one of my theses, is the cult of Trump is comprised of a lot of other cults, authoritarian cults, including these New Apostolic Reformation churches where the leaders say they're an apostle or prophet and get direct revelations, and God told them Trump was going to be elected in 2020, so the Democrats must have, right? So, but I don't want to get too far off on the Catholic Church, but we can look throughout history, and Dr. Commons actually was the first one who said to me, "Steve, predator and prey. Think predator and prey. That's the frame to think about."
No, I'm sorry, I should just generalize and then say there are many religions or cults, however you want to say, where you can leave, or if you leave, you are excommunicated, no family can talk. All that is a kind of...
And I think that's abusive and mind control.
Yes.
I really do.
Well, I'd say it a different way. Does it help or hurt? I mean, very simple. And the problems facing human beings don't rely on dogma to be there. So the problems we're trying to solve are pre-dogma and pre-theologic. And I take issue with Steve because for 60 years I've identified myself as a radical, nonviolent, faith-based activist. And I say, Steve, radical means going to the roots. And I've been slammed and slandered with that for 6 decades trying to make things better. And where are you going to find a better person?
I'm a radical under your definition.
Well, that's right. And so the point I try to make is speak of the content and the substance because the labels are no good. I'm Jewish. And talking with Israelis, they say to them, tell me what Zionism means. I never use that word. And it's like, because the concerns we have are fundamental and shared. If we look at what's common, that's what we see. If we look at what's different, that's what we see. I would take exception. Human rights, torture, and slavery are absolutely non-derogable, absolute, by all the statutes. Right to life is conditional on capital punishment is frowned upon, but it's not an absolute prohibition. I think the problem is that the states endorse, but they're the perpetrators. And that's where the tension comes.
Next question, yes. We want to leave time for our last presenter.
I'm fine. I yield my time.
You sure?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Matthew
He's
Harris.
presenting next session, by the way, so.
I just wanted to relate what you said to the theme of our previous session. Now, I mean, freedom of mind, how does that relate to the rights under the Convention for persons with disabilities in terms of equality before the law, in terms of the right to refuse psychiatric assessment, psychiatric diagnosis, psychiatric treatment? Do you have anything to say on that?
Not a lot because it hasn't been developed yet. I mean, we have the Declaration of Freedom of Mind, but it doesn't make explicit reference to psychiatric treatment or the right. I mean, it builds on existing rights. I see it as a missing piece.
Well,
So-
I would say it quite differently. 2.1 billion people identify as Christian. 1.6 billion identify as Muslim. That's just the deists. And to me, it's so self-evident, it just beggars discussion, because in the image of God, kingdom of God is within you, Buddha nature, Atman. I mean, regarding Trump, what I said is that God is on the side of the big battalions, meaning 40% of the people would be happy to throw all of us in boxcars, or at least behave that way. And the question is, what about the other 60%? And as critical as I am about a lot of things in the States, is that most people, most of the time, want to believe they're doing the right thing. And the real, where the rubber meets the road, is who's going to get to them, who's going to be clever. Steve spoke from his heart and his experience. Tom was, again, teaching. I refer to that article almost every time I do a consultation on that issue. You're looking at precatory, what we hope. But it seems to me so fundamental that most human beings believe or want to be helped to believe that there's a basic decency that, what's there to discuss?
And I would just say planetary survival is my bubble.
Now, the right,
I really think we need to be solution focused and work backwards, because right now, as you said, we're going, because authoritarians want to destroy America. They really do, because then they can take over more places, et cetera, and there are named groups, including Putin. He was very upset that the Soviet Union collapsed, and he's been on an agenda to destroy America. Yes, Tom?
I just wanted to comment on your remark, and I think you're absolutely right, but I was still appalled by the case of Rogers versus Commissioner, which was a right to refuse treatment case in Massachusetts. And the original decision was based on the freedom of psychotic thought as an argument against treatment.
substituted judgment, what would the person want for themselves?
Right. So, there is an interweaving here of a number of different forces.
I want to say that I feel an obligation to be positive and to not do a bombing run that floods you with so much information that's awful that all that happens is paralyzed. My son is a human rights expert and, of course, smarter than I am. Maybe we'll learn that I know something, but the hard rights, the blue rights, the rule of law, the civil rights, the red rights of economic rights, the soft rights of the environmental rights, the green rights. And what I assert, because I have seen it and I believe it, is that the right to rule of law, the right to sustenance, the right to a safe home are universal, inseparable, non-derogable.
John, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for your presentations. They fit together quite nicely, and building up to Matt's the vulnerability of the end time of human rights. And and when I think about trying to put it in a historical context, in a way, none of these things are new. I mean, propaganda is not new, misinformation is not new, violence and torture are not new. These are centuries-old phenomena. But in the 20th century, with the rise of totalitarian regimes like the Nazi regime, Soviet regimes, totalitarian regimes especially are trying to control everything, including the inner person, right? You think of the Chinese re-education camps, etc.
Exactly.
Going into the 21st century, what do you think? I mean, these phenomena have been around as long as human beings have been around, but to what impact does modern technology change this equation for you? And this is for any of you.
Human beings did not evolve to be online. This is a new development, and it's changing our brains. Young people are on screens instead of playing in real life and having that connection and intimacy, and there are billionaires who are on the spectrum who want us to spend all of our energy in the metaverse instead of being with real people and solving real problems. So, has anyone heard of the Center for Humane Technology?
Social Dilemma?
Huge.
Does anyone watch The Social Dilemma?
There's a documentary. So that's Tristan Harris, who is a former ethicist at Google, humanetech.com. That's what they're trying to do, is call out the destructiveness of platforms where they're being used to monetize. Data is being collected. In the US, there are 5,000 data points on every voting American that's been collected. And when you're online, unless you have wiped out all of the data, which I think is now impossible because it's on the dark web, and there are companies selling it to third parties like cults, you can be putting on, a virtual reality thing to play gaming, but they could be playing and changing the faces to ones that you like people that you love, without you even knowing about it. And
but I take a different
we need
position.
regulations.
See, if you say, is technology weaponized against us? I mean, the American election, of course. It doesn't mean we lay down like a carpet and have people walk on us. But I would make the point that what was important is even in the undue influence and testamentary capacity, is the issue of trust, fiduciary, and the connections. That it, of course, I had to learn how to turn on a laptop and shut my phone off. I mean, of course you have to know technology. And of course you have to know how not to be dog meat and chewed for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But if it were so powerful with the constant universal surveillance, doesn't that tell you something that there's more force than that?
Yes.
That's the point that I think we
I
have
told
to
him,
make.
and then I'll call you. Okay. Did you want to say something?
Yes. So I have a question that I think sort of ties the presentations together with regards to rejecting information. Well, kind of comments. It seems to me that a lot of the impetus to really reject information that you find personally disagreeable comes from that you're practically clinging to a sense of self and a sense of reality that derives from your own worldview, the way you perceive the world around you. Because you have your own self-worth tied up in that, any information that threatens your worldview, that threatens your perspectives, is recognized as a threat to the self and therefore rejected out of hand. It seems to me that this is
Which leads to confirmation bias.
Yes. And
Well, it's also interactive. A slide that I took out because it was didn't have much time. Individuals are the infinitesimals whose sum in the calculus of culture creates society and civilization. So if somebody wants to say it's only individual or it's only collective, they don't know what they're talking about, and that isn't the way it works.
Well, the question I sort of have about that is, this does seem to play into both the question of freedom of mind, because you have people exercising a distinct unwillingness to entertain thoughts and ideas and information contrary to their own thinking. It also plays into how cults operate, because they very much want you to develop that sense of self that is tied to your communal understanding, to the worldview of this is how things are and this is what makes you you.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not exclusive to that either.
Right. So I would argue that humanity can either evolve or devolve, and if you study developmental psychology, if you're being a responsible parent, you want your child to grow up and have their own thoughts and values and make their own choices, as opposed to authoritarian parenting where you want the kid to be a clone of you and obey you forever.
Comma, comma. Every thought, every word, every act matters. And it's not like what we do doesn't matter. As soon as they get you burned to a crisp with feeling helpless and paralyzed, You have to do whatever you can to move back from that. Because we are either going to be protagonists or victims.
So can I just say that I do for a living talk to people who've been indoctrinated into totalist authoritarian cults. What doesn't work, if I can use you for a minute, is saying, you're wrong. You're in a cult. You're brainwashed. You're believing crap, conspiracy theories, because that validates the programming that you're persecuting them, that you're the enemy. If you look at my material, my videos, and my books, the way to approach it is, hey, you're smart, you have a master's in international law, I'm really curious. How did you arrive at this belief? And then if they say, do your own research, it's like, no, go back in time. When was the first time you heard of QAnon, for example, which was 2017, by the way. That was not a thing until 2000. But the idea is questioning is the power.
And basic
And
respect.
rapport and trust and compassion.
So
And-
not like this.
And taking the frame of,
Also,
convince me.
also,
I'm willing to put myself out there to believe what you believe, but you have to break it down into smaller pieces, but let's talk about it. So when people tell me, Steve, you're brainwashed, you're in the cult of Soros, I don't say, come on, I'm the world expert on brainwashing. I say, oh really? Tell me why.
that's an
What's your
interesting theory.
understanding about brainwashing? How interesting. Do you think the Chinese Communist government is brainwashing people? And the two topics that work are trafficking and Chinese Communist brainwashing program. And then I can talk about the bite model, but the point is you have to separate your ego from your beliefs. And I'm going to cite Adam Grant's book, Think Again, which is a brilliant book. And he says, listen, to have a scientific approach, we have hypotheses. We don't have the truth with a capital T that's black and white.
Steve, I know everything, you're making a mistake.
How so, Barry?
I mean,
Tell me more.
between the three of us, or the four of us, or the five of us in the whole group, everybody has something special to add, and maybe if we put it together, we'll make it.
And I want to add that I'm part of a group of colleagues and friends who are all former cult members of one type or another, and we're trying to do a hashtag movement of I Got Out, like Me Too, to destigmatize it. It's like, I have a PhD, but I believe that crap. You know? It's not about intelligence. It really isn't. But people who don't understand social psychology and how the mind works, and this is the fundamental attribution error. Have you ever heard that term in social psychology? The fundamental attribution error is if you're trying to understand his behavior, you over-attribute individual variables or personality variables, and you underestimate social influence variables.
These
Right?
guys
So
are
instead of saying Steve was dumped by his girlfriend and women flirted and seduced him, it was like, what was wrong with Steve? He was weak, he was stupid, he was looking for a father figure, he didn't have a proper religious education. I've been doing this work for decades, and I can tell you some of the brightest people in the world have been co-opted by authoritarian cults. The good news is people wake up and they go, this isn't working. One of my friends was in Scientology for 30 years and got to OT7, which is almost the top of the bridge to total freedom, is their crap way of saying it. And what helped her get out was a Dutch person being kind and generous and saying, I really want to understand. You're intelligent. Help me understand. And later, he said to her, are these your friends, meaning Scientologists? And she started thinking, he's the enemy, but I like him. And I want to be more with him than I want to be with the group that I've been in for 30 years. And she exited. And she's thrilled. And she's got a big YouTube channel, Tori Christman's thing. People want freedom. They don't want to be exploited and abused. And I'm not sure, you live in China, but my thesis is that given a choice, people want to be free. They don't want to turn over their lives to somebody else.
There was something I just wanted, I didn't have time to show it, but there was a study of internet behavior, and they looked at web activity and how it clustered together. And it clusters on the basis of geography and language. And if you look at China, one is the least isolated and infinity is the maximum isolation. China is actually least isolated in terms of its internet. So, in terms of its internet usage. So if you remove
Except they have a total block around.
well, that's the irony. They wouldn't actually need to do it, you know, in order to maintain that level of social control, because people self-censor.
I would flip the
That's
tape
the dual
around.
identity.
Yeah.
So I did.
These guys and every one of you know all kinds of things that I'm clueless, have all kinds of abilities. You know. However, there's a difference between saying, if I don't know all the answers, I can't act, and I know enough. See, we know enough that there are really dangerous threats. We know that Goebbels and Hitler really were there. We know Mao and Stalin. We know that stuff. We know enough to know that. And I would say in terms of the cage, if we do not have serious structures of justice, we will have to suffer serious injustice.
Yes, I call in.
Being here, I appreciate very much and trying to ask a question.
Go for it. We have like 2 minutes.
All right,
But people are welcome to stay a little longer because it's lunch.
but I'm
if you need to
curious,
go, I understand.
in listening to this, if y'all know of the group of this Mind Freedom or David Oakes, because coming out of the mental treatment, I have many questions. And part of it is the nature of law, which is very linear. But here are a volume of people, Mind Freedom or Robert Whitaker, who writes about Mad in America, the struggle as we take on psychiatry, but it's really the pharma, but it's really the money.
Yeah, money is
So-
corrupting politics in the U.S. When the Supreme Court said people could donate
But if,
black money, dark money.
but if you talk about money and hashtags and internet and the machine, what keeps a people or the people of the tribe to peacefully assemble and just in that act to declare victory and show up?
So
Because it
my-
is in that crowd, the migration, because this I would try to study, but to understand the social thermodynamics, the science, the art, the integration. What is keeping that from happening? Because when you look at all systems.
So I'm going to interrupt you. Forgive me.
No.
I think the solution to the planet is psychoeducation. Like teach everybody, like what's healthy development. When I'm counseling people who are born in authoritarian cults, and maybe their family's still there and is shunning them, they don't know what's normal. Like I have to explain, like having sex with adults when you're 4 years old is not normal. Which
Or
is,
healthy.
or
Even if
healthy,
it's
like
normal.
the children of God and such. But I can teach them, and what's so incredible is our minds are so powerful that people can do rewiring, neuroplasticity, and neurogenesis. I help people be themselves, go back to their core authentic self. Yes?
Hi, Jeff Bennett from SIU School of Medicine in Springfield, Illinois, formerly at the University of Chicago. I've been a psychiatrist for a while. I'm used to training and teaching patient care one person at a time. But there was a movement in my field when I was a resident, and a little bit longer afterwards, in group relations. How do you work with large groups? What are the interactions? The hidden group, the explicit group, and so on. And this discussion, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to trip from our words because there's so much to talk about.
But I'm going to do a blog and include the video of this, by the way. So if you want
I'm wondering if you can, again, speaking about deprogramming and individual interactions related to the treatment of people involved with this. Do you have any references, or can you suggest some references for group relations approaches to this?
What my brain is doing with your question is how do we scale what I do individually to help everybody? And I've been calling out to everybody who has a loved one in the cult of Trump. Don't lose contact. Be warm. I miss you. Remember the good old days when we used to fish together or we used to play racquetball together. I want to hang out with you. Let's put politics aside, whatever. Because what works for the cult leaders is isolation. So they're programming the person, you're being persecuted, and you should be noble because you're being persecuted. But if you take the approach of love and help me understand, it really works. Why? Because the person's real self is still in there. And it doesn't work to be in an authoritarian cult. And I did a TEDx. I did a 4-step reality testing strategy. You can go on my website and watch it if you want. I say you need to unplug from the constant indoctrination through our cell phones and platforms. Take a week off. Go fishing. Do something fun. Second, study models of authoritarian control. Robert Lifton, Margaret Singer, my BITE model. Then deliberately seek out critics and former members. Why? Because if what you're doing is good, you're intelligent, you should be able to discern whether or not it has validity or there's evidence or not. So if you want to really answer the question for yourself, whether you're brainwashed, read the stuff on Chinese communist brainwashing or Hassan, who's this Mooney. And then lastly, go back in time in your mind before you got involved with the group or started changing, being radicalized, knowing what you know now. If you knew then what you know now, would you have joined? Would you have gone to that next meeting? Like if I knew those women were not interested in me, they were just trying to fulfill a recruitment goal for the week, and sexual seduction was one of the major tools, I would have told them to get lost. I wouldn't have said sit down and tell them my life story, right? So, but what I'm trying to say is that dual self that I talked about, it's like if you're educated, you can go back in time and deconstruct your cult identity and how they got inside your head. Like for me, I was brought to see the Exorcist movie in 1974, bust up to Tarrytown, and Moon gave a lecture, God made the Exorcist. This movie is a prophecy of what will happen to you if you leave the Unification Church. I grew up Jewish. We don't believe in Satan and demons, but that shut me down for 2.5 years. Afraid invisible deity, beings were going to invade my mind. So they taught me thought stopping, to say pure, crush Satan, glory to heaven, peace, or whatever. As you were saying, the self-censoring mechanisms that I was taught. But as you can deconstruct it, you're liberating yourself, and it works. But what's happened with mental health professionals, and I'm doing a whole course, online course for mental health, people are coming in with suicidal thoughts or this or that, and clinicians are not asking the history.
I would take a different tack. My whole career, I had to maintain a very impenetrable firewall between my personal political advocacy and my professional work. And in the last couple of years, patients repeatedly brought in their concerns about politics as a mental health issue. I think what I would say, Steve, time matters, attitude matters, other people matter.
Yeah, but I have a video on my YouTube of a woman who was in a Bible cult for 13 years. She exited, and she was in institutions and given drugs for 11 years before she called me and said, you wrote a book and you mentioned my group. And I did work with her for 4 days, and she didn't need medication anymore. And she went on to get a PhD, get married, and have 2 kids, and she's a nurse.
I was trying to say your work matters and it's valuable, and Thank
No, but there is a point that until everybody gets how to discern what's ethical and unethical, and we adopt a more positive attitude that we can make change, these 30, 40 million people can exit, but it's going to require a very strategic approach. But it starts with their family and friends saying, hey, I love you.
you.
I
It's not
miss
an
you.
attitude, it's scientific, evidence-based.
But is it an issue of, if there are so many that are being hurt, is it a question for those who've been hurt? It's as if the challenge is to try to learn law enough to come find the attorney, or as a statute of limitation, because to frame these cases, they're very complex and it takes a
Thank you,
lot
Berta.
to unpack.
There are general themes and it's specific in each instance.
Yes, but each human is unique, and to understand the uniqueness of the gift of the light within the vessel, to bring it into the court,
The universal manifests in infinite ways.
yes it is.
So, thank you so much for coming, and hopefully this has provoked some curiosity, and you'll want to learn more, think about how it might help your practice or a loved one in your life that you haven't talked to for a few years. And you'll reach out and say, hey, I miss you. How you doing? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chief.